Greetings. Probably maybe we can give a few more minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes before we start. I hope it's okay with you. It's now 16:04 my time. Probably, if you agree, we can start at it, Sabas. Then maybe those who are going to join us, find us already started. So let me start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on gender and disability inclusion in evaluation. I'm Innocent, and today I will be your facilitator. It's a pleasure to have all of you joining us today. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to introduce our distinguished speakers for today. I'll start with the Adit Bola. She's an evaluation officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and she's also a co-convener of the United Nations Evaluation Group, UNEG, Working Group on Gender, Disability, and Human Rights. We are also joined by Sabas Monroy. He is an evaluation program management officer at the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, OHCHR, and a former convener of the United Nations Evaluation Group, UNEG, Working Group on Gender, Disability, and Human Rights. Thank you, Adit, and thank you, Sabas, for joining us today. We look forward to your insightful presentations. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to all of our participants. I'm glad to see such a diverse and growing group. I'm sure others will be joining as we proceed. Throughout the session, I encourage you to actively participate in the discussion. There's an opportunity for question and answers, but there is also the chat. There is also an opportunity for you to raise your hands in case you've got other submissions or any interventions to make. Now, let me briefly walk you through today's agenda. We'll just start with what we are doing now, the short introductions. Then I'll move on to Adit, who will do the first part of the presentation, where she's going to talk about focusing. Your presentation is going to focus on the updated guidance for integrating human rights and gender in evaluations, as well as the UN system-wide action plan on gender equality. The second part of the presentations, it will then be done by Sabas, who will focus his presentations on the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. After their two presentations, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll open the floor for those questions and further discussions. From there, we have final parting words from the two presenters. Then I will wrap up the webinar. But before we start, I would like to remind you all of some few housekeeping issues. The first one, please keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking to minimize background noise. The second one, if you'd like to speak, as I already said, please use the raise hand option. We'll give you the platform to speak. Or you can also use the chat box for any questions or any submissions which you might have. And lastly, today's keyword is inclusion. So let's be mindful of cultural differences and ensure that our language is inclusive and respectful for everyone. I thank you. And thank you once again for joining. And now let's dive on to today's session. Adit, it's over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentations. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure for both of us to be here and for organizing this. It's a great initiative, and I'm glad to see so many of you joining in. So thank you to everyone who could make the time. Innocent, I can't see your presentation, see the presentation. Could you share your screen?
Adit, please confirm if you're not seeing my screen.
I can see it.
Yeah, I'm putting it in presentation mode shortly. There you go. Over to you, Adit.
That's great. Thank you. If you could go to slide 2, the next slide. Thank you. So we have a lot that we would like to share with you today. I'll get right into it. I wanted to start off by looking a bit at human rights and gender equality in evaluations, and just looking and talking about the UNEG norms and standards, which are there for these. As you know, the UNEG norms and standards for evaluation do highlight the need for the integration of human rights and gender equality in evaluations, and they underpin the commitment to the principle of no one left behind. This is Norm 8 and Standard 4.7. The UNEG Gender, Disability and Human Rights Working Group, which is co-convened by UN Women and GEDHR, develops guidance, disseminates it, and facilitates the exchange of experiences. Our work includes updating the UNEG guidance on integrating human rights and gender equality in evaluations, which I'll talk a bit about in the next few slides. We also do annual reports on the UN SWOP evaluation performance indicator. And we've also been responsible for the development of guidance on integrating disability inclusion in evaluations and reporting on the UNDIS entity accountability framework evaluation indicator. This was in 2022, so a while back, but it's still relevant. I also have here a mention of the UN Administrative Instruction on evaluation, which requires UN Secretariat entities have an evaluation policy, and the accompanying guidelines do require that these policies include gender, human rights, and disability considerations. So I just wanted to touch a bit on the background. I'm sure you're all aware of this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So UNEG first published the guidance on integrating human rights and gender equality in evaluations in 2014. In 2021, the working group undertook a gap analysis of the 2014 guidance, and we began the update in 2022. The key objectives for this update were to streamline the guidance, to address the gaps identified by the working group in the gap analysis, and to incorporate current theory, knowledge, and good practices on the integration of human rights and gender equality across different phases of evaluation processes. It was quite an intensive process, and Updated guidance is now available. It's been published in 2024. I'm not sure if everyone has had the chance yet to see it, but it's available on the UNEG website. Thank you, Savas. This updated guidance now provides evaluators with enhanced tools and frameworks in order to ensure that human rights and disability inclusion and gender equality are integrated into evaluations. It does reflect evolving best practices and emerging priorities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what's new in the guidance? Very briefly, so we have expanded definitions of groups and situations of vulnerability. Leave no one behind in intersectionality. The guidance does now highlight the importance of this principle in evaluations. We also see in this guidance updated tools and examples. There are a number of checklists and boxes which can be used for you in order to I want to say simplify, but in order to kind of streamline the process as well and to provide a more enhanced experience for you as well. It emphasizes how different identities intersect to impact outcomes. The guidance also incorporates the OECD evaluation quality standards, and it provides more details, including on persons with disabilities. Next one, please. So some key takeaways from the update, which we have now. Human rights and gender equality responsive evaluations have two dimensions. They assess human rights and gender equality results, and they apply the mainstreaming practices in the evaluation process. All the evaluations, regardless of whether they have a focus on human rights and gender equality or they don't, are expected to be inclusive and to mainstream human rights and gender equality principles. The guidance promotes an intersectional understanding of different vulnerabilities that people experience and the need for those vulnerabilities to be considered in evaluations. UN evaluations that do not consider human rights and gender equality do risk reinforcing patterns of discrimination and exclusion or leaving them unchanged. The updated guidance aims to reflect all groups in situations of vulnerability, including persons with disabilities, in line with the principle of leaving no one behind, which is at the heart of the 2030 agenda. And just, I want to take a quick mention of what the working group is planning for next year as well, taking into account this updated guidance. What we're looking at doing is also developing some condensed versions. So for example, a PowerPoint and maybe checklists, tools, which would help disseminate the guidance even further. For example, and this is just an example that I'm giving off the top of my head, but for example, when evaluations are conducted, something which would enable the consultants to integrate the guidance more effectively rather than having to read through the whole document, something which summarizes it, which you can easily provide to the evaluation team in order to enable them to integrate and include this guidance more effectively and efficiently in your evaluations. Next slide, please. I thought there was another one. Okay, well that's it on yeah, that's great. Thank you. So this was just a quick note on the updated guidance, but I'm sure if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards. I'll move on to the UN SWOP. So what is the UN SWOP evaluation performance indicator? In 2006, the CEB endorsed the UN system-wide policy on gender equality and the empowerment of women. To operationalize this policy, a UN system-wide action plan on gender equality and the empowerment of women, which is UN SWOP, was developed. This was to promote a common understanding, enhance a system-wide coherence, and advance a progressive approach towards gender mainstreaming. In 2012, the CEB endorsed the action plan. So this indicator assesses the extent to which evaluation reports of an entity meet the gender-related UNEG norms and standards and demonstrate effective use of the UNEG guidance. We also have the technical note and the scorecard, which establish guidance and a minimum set of criteria to capture the overall elements related to mainstreaming gender equality in evaluations. Next slide, please. So looking at UN SWAP 3.0, which is basically the latest update, which is taking place 2024, this raises the bar for gender mainstreaming in the UN system. It integrates relevant actions from the Secretary General System-Wide Gender Equality Acceleration Plan, wow, that's a mouthful, and it elevates the accountability framework requirements. So what are the key changes? I just want to quickly go through this. I'm sure some of you would have already heard about this as well. The main ones are that you can see in approaches requirements, we have referenced the 2024 UNEG guidance. In meets requirements as well, which is the second column, you can see that the 2024 UNEG guidance is referenced here. And in the third column, which is exceeds requirements, again, the 2024 UNEG guidance is referenced, but there's also a key change because at least one evaluation to assess the entity's corporate performance on gender mainstreaming or equivalent has to be conducted every 5 years. And this was previously 5 to 8 years. So they've tightened it up and made it slightly more stricter in the sense that you don't have that leeway anymore. It has to be 5 years. Next slide, please. This is just a slide which I wanted to quickly show the different criteria, the 4 criteria which are there when you look at your UN SWAP analysis. So basically, is it integrated in the evaluation scope, in the evaluation criteria, and the questions are designed in a way that related data will be collected? The second criteria is that gender responsive methodology, methods, tools, and data analysis techniques are selected. The third criteria is that the evaluation findings, conclusions, and recommendations reflect a gender analysis. And the fourth one is, as I mentioned, at least one evaluation is conducted every 5 years. And just a note on this as well, the UN SWAP EPI does recommend 3 modes of assessment. So these are self-assessment, peer review, and external review, which are conducted by an independent reviewer. In 2023, we found that 20 out of the 50 reporting entities actually undertook external or independent assessments, while the majority of them, which is 60%, opted for self-assessment. So notably, no entity utilized the whole peer review modality, which is interesting to note, actually. I mean, there is an issue, perhaps there would be a coordination issue, and how do we go about doing that if we do implement, if entities do choose to undertake the peer review. But I think it's interesting to note that nobody actually went down that route. So hopefully maybe in the future. Several entities have integrated guidelines from the scorecard into their evaluation quality assurance systems, which is good to note. And while most entities assessed all evaluations conducted in 2023, some of them included a representative sample. So that's also, I think, an interesting insight into how different agencies conduct their UN SWAP analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I'll just, Sebas will go through that, but just to quickly wrap up on this in terms of next steps for the UN SWAP, a substantive revision of the technical note and accompanying scorecard would be undertaken in 2025. This revision will basically include alignment with relevant frameworks and guidance documents, including the UN SWAP 3.0 framework, the 2024 UNEG guidance on human rights and gender equality, the 2020 UNEG ethical guidance, and other key documents. So that is something that is coming up in 2025, and that's going to be quite a major update as well. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Sebas now, who will take you through UNDIS.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, Innocent, EvalForward colleagues, for the invitation. Yeah, now we want to talk specifically about disability inclusion in evaluations. And you'll see it's very closely related to what Aditi shared with us about the integration of gender and human rights. Everything starts with the UNDIS accountability framework. Was launched just in 2019, but really under implementation very recently from 2020 onwards, probably. And this new accountability framework to assess the integration of disability is based on the gender UN SWAP. You will see later that we probably have a similar approach, but what's important to mention is that in the UN evaluation group, particularly in this working group that we have been working with UN Women and other colleagues in different agencies, 25 to 30 agencies in total. In these areas of disability and groups in situational vulnerability, we learned that we are looking for more concrete guidance, useful examples, easy ways to understand what we need to do in order to integrate disability or other groups in situations of vulnerability. And hopefully we try to reflect this in this UNEG guidance developed between 2020 and 2022, and finally launched just 2 years ago. So you can look at the guidance later, but to give you a snapshot on that. What is the purpose of this UNEG evaluation indicator? Is to assess how disability has been integrated on the evaluation in all the evaluation processes and phases. It covers basically how are we integrating disability inclusion in guidelines, in evaluation teams, in evaluation criteria and questions, methodologies, findings, etc. And finally, very important to keep in mind this, the same as gender or human rights, is relevant and applies to any type of evaluation that you conduct. This is always something interesting to address. We have seen some examples in the past from technical agencies, and it's always possible to integrate all these elements in your evaluation, including gender or disability. Next slide, please, Inos. So you will see in this formulation of the UNEG indicator on disability follows same methodology, same approach as the UN SWAP on gender. And we have divided this in 3 steps. First, the idea is that you integrate these issues of disability inclusion in your guidance. That means that you have any evaluation policy, framework, or guidelines that you use as the main framework to conduct your evaluations. Let's try to reflect there the importance, the relevance of integrating disability. We have done this before for gender. I'm sure we have more than 10 years doing this integration of gender. Now we're starting with disability, but it's important to keep in mind that we can do it also for other groups in situations of vulnerability. If you don't have your own guidance, thinking of small evaluation functions with not enough capacity, you can think of doing this by adopting the guidance from other organizations. For example, this guidance developed by UNEG, by the UN Secretariat, thanks to OIOS, or those used by other agencies. Then the next step to meet requirements in terms of disability inclusion in evaluation is to apply this guidance. You have the guidance telling you what to do. Let's apply it to every evaluation process that you conduct in your entity or organization. And finally, to exceed requirement, in addition to have the guidance in place, to apply it to your evaluations, let's try to assess how we are doing by conducting every year or every programming cycle a meta-analysis of the evaluation findings to see how are we doing in terms of integration of disability and what can be improved for the next cycle. Next, Innocent, please. So the question is, now that we need to integrate disability inclusion in evaluations, how to do it? That was the purpose of developing this guidance, as mentioned, trying to have a very short guidance, very concrete, with examples based on the experience. So this working group on gender, disability, and human rights worked around approximately 2 years to develop this guidance that I shared the link in the chat. And what we have there is some key steps to integrate disability in evaluations. And this work, as mentioned, was the base also for the revision of the big UNEG human rights and gender equality guidance for the integration of these elements in evaluations. Next slide, please. Let's see. As mentioned, very basic steps is to have this disability inclusion area integrated in your guidance by, for example, using a template for terms of reference, using a checklist, using guidance from other organizations, even anything that can guide evaluation managers and evaluation consultants to integrate disability will be useful. But let's provide some guidance to those in charge of managing or conducting evaluations. Next slide, please. Then, very important, now talking about concrete steps, how to meet these requirements in terms of integrating disability. One, clearly, as mentioned, particularly in the working group, we consider that one important tool to ensure the integration of disability or any other mainstreaming area is to put this clearly in the terms of reference. The terms of reference for every evaluation that you conduct in your office, let's ask that they need to integrate disability. Be very specific on how to do it, in what phases of the evaluation process, so any evaluator can follow this guidance in their terms of reference and do their best effort to integrate disability. Very important to consider these elements during the process, and particularly as mentioned in the terms of reference for your evaluation. First, talking about evaluation teams and evaluation management structure. We need to have, of course, experts, consultants, evaluators, who ideally have experience in disability inclusion, the same in gender integration, or other groups in vulnerability. We know that it's difficult to have this because it's very recent framework, so not necessarily we will have a lot of consultants with this expertise right now. But what we can do is that we can identify who is the focal point in our entity responsible for supporting the UNDIS application in your office and ask him or her to be part of your reference group. But if you have any other expertise in your entity, let's invite them to join the evaluation team, for example, as a reference group, as part of the management, or just being interviewed and taking into consideration their points of view. This is very important in these first years when we are trying to start integrating disability in evaluations. Next steps, probably the most important one, is to integrate disability in your evaluation objectives, scope, but most important, in your evaluation questions. There is usually a doubt here. Do we need to have an additional criterion on gender, human rights, and disability, or can we just mainstream this across the other OECD data criteria? Those alternatives are fine. We prefer to have an explicit gender, human rights, and disability evaluation criteria to make it more visible. So we start first by expressing clearly in the evaluation objective and scope that this evaluation will assess, as usual, the relevance, the effectiveness, impact, etc. We see the criteria, but also this evaluation in the terms of reference, we will ask to integrate gender, disability, and human rights mainstreaming as well. That's very important for us. Then, in terms of evaluation questions, what are the main questions that we need to ask? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Usually, for example, when you ask for relevance, you ask, is this project or program relevant for the needs of this and that stakeholder? There, you can be very specific and ask, are we doing what persons with disability need? Are we doing what women need in this? Are we doing what indigenous peoples need in this or that context, etc.? So you need to be very specific on your evaluation questions. Effectiveness, the same. If you are looking for results and you draft an evaluation questions on effectiveness, you can ask, is this project achieving the expected results? Or you can be more specific, are the results of this project reaching also women, also indigenous peoples, youth? Are they reaching persons with disability? Are they receiving the same benefits as others? That will help the evaluator to think about it and to consider if these persons are really being integrated into the scope of the program. So be very specific with your evaluation questions and try to have this type of questions addressing what person with disability need, what are the results that they are expecting, what findings could be useful for them, etc. To do this, in step 4, you can see that we talk about methodology and stakeholder mapping. That means it's key to identify what are the key stakeholders for every evaluation and how it's important for them to be represented and to be considered through the whole evaluation process. This is important in case of these groups in situation of vulnerability because usually they are not visibilized in evaluations. So let's make sure that in a community is there an important component of indigenous peoples. Let's try to ask the right questions about indigenous peoples. If we are working in a context, in a program where it's key to have all the community involved, let's ask specifically for the involvement of women, let's ask for the involvement of persons with disability. That's why it's important to do this stakeholder mapping, identify organizations working with persons with disability, identify organizations working with women, youth, etc., children even, etc. And in terms of methodology, let's try to do our best to have data collection tools that are accessible. For example, very obvious thing, when you conduct a survey, let's try to make it easy to understand for everybody, for example, by having in different languages, for example, using tools to ensure that any meeting room is accessible for persons with disability, or creating accessible documents that needs to be revised by the stakeholders in a particular evaluation. We need to take into consideration all these different steps to facilitate the participation and to hear the voice of those that we want to integrate there in these groups in situation of vulnerability. Finally, at the end of this process, what we expect is to have relevant findings, conclusions, and recommendations that are useful for persons with disability. In this case, the same for women, for indigenous people, youth, the poor, migrants, etc. So we should ask in our terms of reference the consultants to have a specific section with findings very concrete and very relevant for these groups. And of course, at the end, in the final report, we expect to have overall conclusions on the situation of gender, disability, human rights, etc., and recommendations. This is very important to talk about recommendations because as we have just started to implement the disability inclusion framework, probably these projects or programs that you are evaluating now in 2024 were developed 3-4 years ago when the UNEG was not yet in place. So instead of just trying to punish a program because they didn't integrate the disability 4 years ago, what we need to do is to ask them, what are the recommendations that we can take into account for the next phase of this program? This way, we can improve the next program, the next phase, and the colleagues in charge of implementing these programs will find useful that these evaluations are not just looking, assessing their work now, but providing useful and interesting recommendations for the future. Okay, Innocent, please, next slide. And finally, to exceed the UNEG requirements, what we suggest is to conduct a meta-synthesis of evaluation findings. You can find there an example from the meta-analysis that we conducted in GEDHR, just trying to extract all the learnings in terms of disability from all the evaluations conducted during a program cycle. This way, both assessing how we are doing from the methodological side in terms of integrating disability and what are the main findings in terms of disability that we can extract from these evaluation reports through the cycle are useful for us as evaluation management, but it's useful for those colleagues working on programming, on planning in the thematic areas related to disability. So that's the final step, like to close the cycle and provide inputs for the next programming cycle in terms of how can they improve the inclusion and integration of disability in their programs. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to share how we are doing in the UN system. Very important to mention, opposite to the UN SWAP, where UN Women conducts this analysis. In the case of GEDHR or UN Human Rights, is not responsible for the implementation of the UNDIS, but we contribute at least from the evaluation side. And the UNDIS Secretariat prepares this report and these tables with information on the ratings achieved by each indicator. If you can see the evaluation indicator, more than half of the entities are approaching requirements. That means they have disability inclusion in their guidance, but they are still in the process to implement this and to exceed requirements. So that's what we are trying to contribute from the UNEG Gender Equality, Disability, and Human Rights Working Group to facilitate to meet these requirements with this exchange of experiences, disseminating guidance, looking for examples and good practices, so the colleagues can apply the guidance and integrate disability in their evaluation. Next slide, please, Innocent. And finally, just some findings from this report from the UNDIS Secretariat. You can see, very important to mention, first, what I already said, many entities have adopted guidance, but they need support to put it in practice. And related to this, is key to have the capacity to work in disability inclusion. That's why we are suggesting, look for the UNDIS focal point in your entity and ask them to be part of reference groups, ask them for guidance, and of course, feel free to contact the UNEG working group so we can work with you on integration of the guidance, on development, on application of guidance, etc. Finally, worth to mention that several entities are already using the UNEG guidance on integrating disability. I just look at the UNEG website, and it has been downloaded more than 4,000 times, which is a lot to me. So that means that it's useful for several entities, for several colleagues working on evaluation. So we invite you to consult this and invite you also to, if you are in the UN system and part of UNEG, to join this working group. Final slide, please, Innocent. So if you are interested in this area, feel free to contact us. We usually organize this type of webinars or in-person seminars during UNEG Eval Weeks, in-person, webinars through the year, etc. So hopefully we'll have opportunity to work with you the next year, 2025. And that's what we have for today. Let's go back to Innocent for the next part of this webinar. Thank you, Innocent.
Thank you so much, Sabas and Atitse, for the very interesting presentations. Now the floor is open, colleagues. For those who have got questions, I received a message that the chat was not working, but I'm sure my colleagues in IT have sorted this out. So you can give it a try. And those who want to raise hands, please do so. I will have a look here and I'll give you a platform to speak. So now let me try to check in the chat. And let's see, I'm seeing a couple of questions. So probably I can start with these ones, which have been shared in the Q&A. Yeah, so I'm seeing a question from Haile Bayen, who is asking, who will do the disability inclusion rationing? Who will do the disability inclusion rationing? Any mechanism to avoid subjectivity and biasness?
Thank you,
to you,
Innocent.
Atito Sabas.
Yes, thanks a lot. Aditi can add with the experience from the UN SWAP. Aditi was talking about the peer review, for example. This is one of the mechanisms that we suggest. First of all, it depends on your entity. A big entity with enough resources has the possibility to recruit a consultant to conduct this assessment, which is great. It's ideal in terms of objectivity, but could be expensive. An alternative is to conduct peer reviews. So That's what we did at the beginning of the UNSOP 2.0. That means in the working group, you express your interest that your agency could be peer reviewed in terms of the integration. We find a match with another entity, similar size, probably similar thematic approach, and each author revises, assess the author's reports in terms of the disability inclusion. That's a very good practice that we will try to start implementing again, this case with disability and probably with the UNSWAP 3.0. And finally, the alternative, also using the UNSWAP and UNDIS, is self-assessment. But be very careful with that, because of course, it could be subjective, bias, etc. So just to share the example of UN Human Rights, we're a relatively small evaluation function with 3-4 evaluators probably. So what we do is that we conduct an internal peer review. Usually the colleague who hasn't been involved in previous evaluations, he or she is responsible for assessing the other colleagues who have managed evaluations during the year. That means that, for example, Aditi will assess the evaluations that I manage, and I will assess the international disability in the evaluation that Aditi has managed before. So different ways to do it. Look for somebody internally who could be more or less impartial, independent. Look for peer reviews. Look for consultants. It depends on the resources that you count. But again, a peer review is a good idea. So we invite anybody interested to join the Gender, Disability, and Human Rights Working Group in July. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sabas. So I'm informed, colleagues, by IT that the chat is disabled by default as well as the microphone. But for those who want to speak, if you can raise your hands, we'll give you the platform or the opportunity to speak. So I'm just looking in terms of if there is anyone with his or her hand up, and we will open the mic for you. And we can also maybe share your questions again in the Q&A. I'm sure that function is not disabled. We'll be able to see your questions.
I will get some questions. Probably Aditi wanted to share a question that is usually raised during these meetings. Is if we need to integrate gender, human rights, disability, but also environment, youth, children, indigenous people, how we do to integrate all these elements? I think this is a very valid question that we have received in previous webinars or seminars. And at the end, first, we need to be aware that resources are scarce. A consultant has to answer 30, 40 evaluation questions will require a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. So we need to be very concise. What are the key elements? That's where it's important to conduct what we mentioned, the stakeholder mapping. Depending on the context of the project, on the focus of the project, all these elements are important, but probably some of them could be prioritized. So classic example that I use, I'm from Central America. I know that in Guatemala or in Bolivia, indigenous peoples are a key element of any program, of any project there. So I will emphasize on taking into account the voices of persons from indigenous peoples. That's key. The same could happen in other contexts, in other areas. So it's important to conduct this stakeholder analysis and define what are the key stakeholders in this case, according to this area of intervention or in this geographical zone that will help you. And very important, as the colleagues who work in the country or regional level, they know better who should be involved, what are the relevant organizations. So that will help us to shape the evaluation that we will conduct.
Thanks a lot, Sabas, for that additional contributions. We have another question from Sokra, who is asking, usually our work focuses on women and youth. My question is, how can you take account disabled people when we talk about the technologies and innovations in project implementation? I don't know if Adit or Saba, if you would want to have a comment on this one. Focusing on disabled people, technologies, and innovations in project implementation.
Aditya, I can start and then you can add. Yeah, I think this is also related to what we talked. In some instances, it's key to integrate, of course, persons with disability from a particular focus. If we talk about technology and innovation, what comes to my mind is, for example, these text-to-speech technologies is a way to do it, or use any other technologies. We are not experts in the thematic side of disability inclusion, but on evaluations, but it's important to ask those who have been part of this effort. In the case of GEDHR, Human Rights, we have a disability team who is responsible for the whole UNIS integration, which implies 15 indicators. One of them is evaluation, but there are also one indicator, for example, on reasonable accommodation, which means providing all the related infrastructure, tools, mechanisms to facilitate the participation of persons with disability. This includes, for example, technologies and innovation. What we need to do in these cases is, of course, ask the colleagues in the thematic areas who knows better than us. Second, of course, be aware of what others are doing in these areas is always useful, because probably what you are trying to solve has been already discussed, addressed, and solved by other entities. And at the end, try to learn from their experiences in this. But I think in general, yes, access to technology, access to innovation is key. And if you are talking about people and how to integrate people into a project, into benefit from a program, you always have the opportunity to explore, ask, how can we better integrate persons with disability in this area? Over.
I would
Okay.
also, can I just
Sure.
add to that?
Adit, please.
I think Sabas covered everything, but I would also suggest maybe look at similar projects which took place, not just from other agencies, but even your own agencies, and see how you can learn better from them. Just in terms of the inclusion of disability in that sense. I think we have a lot of learning to do from our own projects as well, and I think that is the whole purpose of evaluations, not just to learn from others, but to also learn from ourselves and to inform decision making accordingly. So I think it would be a good starting point as well, if that helps. Thank you.
Thanks. And we have another question from Pride Mkwali. And I see Sumaya as well. Sumaya's hand is up. We are having IT. They will try to give you a platform to speak. Sumaya Gafori, then probably let's give him or her an opportunity to speak now, and I'll get back to the other question in the Q&A. So Sumaya, please go ahead with your submission or
Hello,
question.
hi. Can you hear me?
Sure, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hi. I apologize for my voice. It's just the cold here. But I was just wondering, in context of Afghanistan specifically and other underdeveloped countries, in the current political and humanitarian crisis, how does the UN monitor the effectiveness of its gender and disability inclusion efforts in Afghanistan, for instance? And are there any examples of indicators that have been successfully used to measure progress?
Thank you, Sumaya. If I may, probably Edith has more information from the UN sub report, but I'm aware that the UNDIS accountability framework, and I think the UN sub has both have two dimensions. One is at the entity level globally, and then there are also assessments at the country level. So probably the focal point for UN SWAP in UN Women, or the focal point on UNDIS, it could be sometimes ILO in charge of that, it could be sometimes WHO, different agencies working in these areas, could be aware of the assessment of the UNDIS accountability framework and the UN SWAP accountability framework at the country level, which is a very good question. In general, gender mainstreaming has been a key part of the UNDAF in the past, or the new name of the UN system-wide frameworks. And if an evaluation of the whole UN framework is conducted in an office, usually it should also integrate the assessment of gender. And more recently, hopefully, they are starting to integrate disability. So I think these are useful tools to look for. Any UN SOP or UNDIS reporting at the country level, or reports assessment conducted on the overall UN framework at that country. Hopefully, we can find information at the country level there. Over.
Thank you.
So maybe I can move on to the question from Pride in the Q&A. So Pride is saying we are trying to include people with disability in grievance readiness mechanism in South Sudan. Unfortunately, we have not been successful, as they do not seem to show up when we call for meetings. Any advice on how we can get them more involved in a context where they seem to shy away from public gathering? Any thoughts, Dita and Sabas?
I can go first, and Sabas, please add. I mean, I would suggest maybe one-on-one, if you're trying to call them in a, just speaking out of experience, sometimes we do focus group interviews. We do larger interviews when we conduct and manage evaluations, but perhaps having individual interviews, I'm saying interviews, but individual meetings with colleagues, because maybe they're not open to coming out in a group. So maybe that would be a good way to kind of reach out to them one-on-one if you have that opportunity to do so. The other option is to ask them what they need, because maybe there is some specific requirements which is not being addressed in terms of, for example, Sabas mentioned infrastructure, what their needs are. Maybe they have fears related to that. And I'm just speaking very generally, but sometimes it's something that we don't think of as simply, but it is something that they require. So I would suggest doing that as a starting point if you haven't already.
Thank you, Aditi. Probably just to add, that is a very important point on cultural sensitivities. Sometimes it depends on the country or region where we are conducting an evaluation. I always remember there are cases where women and men cannot be sit together in a focus group, for example, something that doesn't seem very obvious, but you need to be aware how things work. That's why it's always important to ask the colleagues who work directly in these countries and not to make assumptions. In this particular case of persons with disability, I think it's important to try to contact them individually. For example, if there is an issue of accessibility to a place or not to gather with other people, of course, there is the possibility to have a phone call, to conduct a survey if technology is possible. But what is important exactly to identify the needs of every stakeholder and ask directly those conducting the evaluation, please make any possible effort to involve them and to get their inputs in any evaluation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabas and Ajit, for that. And colleagues, once again, for those who want to speak and maybe make contributions, please, you can raise your hand, and we have our IT here. We'll be able to give you the platform to speak. We'll read another contribution from Janet in the Q&A. Janet says, the UN agents where I work, them without, has had a disability inclusion strategy since 2021. Given that its project lasts 5 to 8 years, we cannot yet hold the United Nations agents accountable for its work on disability because the projects are still ongoing and we evaluate at the end of the project. This has been our stance to date. Is this too simplistic? Could our evaluation office be doing more? Quite a very mouthful and dense question. Over to you, Sabas and Aditi, with any reflections on this?
Thank you, Janet. I think we face the same challenge even in UN human rights when we started to implement the UNEG accountability framework and evaluation indicator in 2020. We started, 2020 or 2021, at least 3-4 years ago, and that was the case. Okay, we tried to put questions on disability in the evaluation terms of reference, and that was exactly the response from the colleagues, from the project managers. How can you assess this when this was not in place? We were not ready, we were not doing it, so don't punish me for not integrating this. And they are right. Very important to keep in mind. We are not asking evaluators to assess these areas because we want to shame, we don't want to punish, we don't want to affect those colleagues working on this project. What we want to do is to help them to improve their projects or program. So in these cases, it totally makes sense. Okay, let's, in these first years of implementation of the disability inclusion strategy, not to be too hard with them, try to be flexible. Every little step in the right direction is a positive step. If they are doing something as simple as just starting to disaggregate data by gender disability, is good, that is fine. If they are not doing anything concrete, let's conduct evaluations and recommend for the next phase of the project. You can integrate disability inclusion, doing this or that, disaggregating data, looking for specific activities, identifying stakeholders, working with organizations, working with people with disabilities, etc. So there are several ways to improve. So at this stage, it's not just about assessing them and to give them a bad rating. It's about helping them to improve. At the end, this is the purpose of the UNEG accountability frame. Over.
Thanks, Sabas. Colleagues, do we have any other questions? If not, then probably I think we are just right on time. We'll pass over the floor to Adit first for the last remarks, and then I'll pass it over again to Sabas. Over to you, Adit.
No, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for joining in. I think it's a very important discussion to have, and it's great to see so many of you here. As Sabas mentioned, please join the UNEG working group as well. It would be great to have your participation in it, to whoever can join. And we will be looking as a working group as well to be organizing further events similar to these over the next year as well. We just have sorry, I just got another message at the same time. So no, we'll be looking to organize further dissemination events. We had one recently in Geneva, actually, for Geneva-based colleagues, which I think was very interesting to be able to learn from each other and to learn from the experiences of different agencies as well. And I think it's great to get that kind of practical exposure. And I hope that we can do more in the future as well and make them more interactive as well. So this was a great opportunity. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, Innocent. Just to add, as mentioned by Aditi, we have been doing this type of sessions in person or webinars during the last year since the launch of the new guidance. We are happy to contribute with this. We did it in Malaga during the UNEG Eval Week. We did it, other colleagues did it in New York with the New York-based agencies. We did it recently in Geneva, and we'll be happy to contribute with this type of exercises whenever you need it. So thanks for inviting us. Just to share with you what I always said, conducting evaluations is very rewarding always because you have the opportunity to improve projects, to improve programs. Conducting evaluations in the UN is even better because you know that you are doing something for people who needs this support, these benefits. But conducting evaluations, particularly in this area of groups in situations of vulnerability, is the most rewarding of all because you are contributing to those who most need all this support, all these benefits for our programs or projects. So thank you for your interest in this. I hope this is useful. Please check and consult the guidance and let us know in case you have any doubt or any further need for support. Thank you. Over.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sabas and Adit. I'm just checking my other colleague from EvalForward, Alexandra, if she would want to say a word or two. Alexandra, maybe Valeria can probably unmute or give the platform to Alexandra.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure, we can hear you loud and clear, Alexandra.
Great. I wanted to say thank you so much. I think this is such an important and relevant topic, and I'm really delighted to be here today to listen in. I had a quick question. In the UN agency that I work for, we began piloting the UN DIS in our evaluations a few years ago, and one of the things that I noted was that it's really, really challenging to capture disability inclusion capacity in our evaluation teams. And I was wondering maybe if you could speak to that and how we could do better in ensuring that we have evaluators with disability inclusion experience when we bring them in to do these evaluations, because I see that that's something that we're definitely struggling with. Over to you, and thank you again.
I think, Aditi, we can mention what we have in our plans. As always, is to prepare some guidance for consultants precisely, hopefully to conduct some training addressed to consultants so we can have a bigger pool of consultants with expertise. But in the interim, what we started doing, at least in our case in UN Human Rights, is to identify consultants who have worked previously on gender, on human rights in general. If they have applied gender mainstreaming, they have applied human rights mainstreaming, it's a little bit easier to try to extrapolate this and integrate also disability. So yeah, I agree. It will be difficult to have the expertise. That's what we mentioned. Let's try to invite the expert in-house to participate in this, to at least in this initial stage, to fulfill this gap in terms of knowledge and disability. And it's also something that has been raised. What about having a pool within UNEG of consultants with this expertise in gender, human rights, disability, etc., for example, that will be useful. We're exploring this, and that's why we need more support, more colleagues involved in the working group. Aditi, please.
Thank you. No, just to add on to what Sabas mentioned, one thing that we found is that the regional networks are a good source as well in terms of at least sharing this information, because I think it's something that we're all kind of struggling with. I mean, we face the same issues as well. So I think the more word you spread out, the better it is. And I think the regional networks are a good source. So maybe reach out to them so that they can spread the word further in that sense, and maybe that way we can start to build a pool, if that helps. And I would suggest also maybe highlighting this in the calls that you put out for evaluation teams, so maybe specifying any experience in this area. Another way that I found, which is a bit of a hit and a miss, but I'm speaking from experience, is to look at relevant evaluations conducted on this topic. So maybe see other agencies have conducted evaluations, which is the team that they've used. Maybe that's a way to identify consultants with expertise in this area, or evaluation teams in that sense. Just speaking from experience, if that helps.
Thank you so much, and that's it for that. I think that brings us, to the end of this webinar. I will not try to, attempt to summarize what our experts have said, but maybe just take this opportunity to thank them once again for their insightful presentations, and also a big thank you, for attending, this webinar, and also for the active contributions. All those contributions came from you. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. As a reminder to all those who attended, the recording of today's webinar will be available on the EvalForward YouTube channel. And the presentation again will be emailed to all those who have registered and attended this webinar. Again, if you were joining, but you're not yet part and parcel of the EvalForward community of practice, please consider joining us. I will share links in the chat, and also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to stay up to date with our events and evaluation developments. We have quite a lot coming in 2025. So please do follow us, do join us. And thank you once again for your time today. We look forward to seeing you at our future events. Stay safe and have a wonderful day or night. From my end here in Harare, it's bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm putting the link for those who want to join in the chat.